Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast, podcast number 181. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the morning of Saturday, July 25th, from poolside at the James Strong Show compound, because we're in the middle of a pandemic, and we're trying to do this as safely as possible. My guest this morning is the Greyfalcon, back again. Welcome back.
Hey, what's up, James?
Now, last time we talked was a little over a month ago, and we had kind of halfway agreed to do this on a fairly regular basis.
Right.
So here you are. Thank you for coming out. Thank
Absolutely,
you for on a nice, beautiful
Yeah.
late July day.
Yeah, this is a pretty nice night, morning.
Yep, 10 o'clock in the morning is probably already.
Usually we do this at night.
Exactly. No mosquitoes that are going to eat us this time.
Right.
It's still hot. It's July in the Midwest. You and I have lived here all our lives,
Yes.
so there should be no surprise for that. The only danger we had here is that one of the neighbors was going to cut his grass. And we actually had one who started, saw the podcast was getting ready to start, and he stopped. So thanks, Steve. I appreciate that.
You can see the demarcation line where the grass.
That's exactly right. He saw it. He stopped. He went inside. So he's probably going to start about 2 o'clock in the afternoon when it cools off a bit.
Right.
Well, hey, I wanted to have you on. There's all kinds of things going on in the world today. Very serious things. The pandemic. Black Lives Matter. Do we play baseball or not? The election that's coming up. In fact, I voted in the primary early voting yesterday. All kinds of things that are very, very serious. But sometimes you have to stop, take a breath, and talk about the things that maybe aren't in the news. Things are just a little bit different. Things that are just a tad off-center. And you, my friend, are a true Renaissance man because you do a little bit of everything. Right. I mean, you work in business. You're an educated man. You are a musician. Yep. You're involved with a lot of local organizations, we'll just say. Yep. And you're an author.
Yes.
And you've been working on a book that's just about finished now.
Yep.
We want to talk about that book. And when you people hear what this book is all about, you're going to say, he does what?
Yeah. So it's a book tentatively titled Alpha Omega now. The book is basic, and the title is basically about the idea of, I guess, the morality or the concept of being the strongest in a particular science fiction setting. But we go into the psychology of it, because in the movies you have the most powerful, be like the Hulk, Thor, Superman. And what always fascinated me is that recently there's always this, in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a lot of almost polarizing dialogue on the most powerful people in a particular science fiction setting. And it's kind of evolved in that as I wrote it. It's like the character that I created was actually from a role-playing game that I was a vampire role-playing game I played at one point.
So there you go. You said the V word. That's the unique thing about this book.
Yes.
The main character is what?
It's a vampire.
There you go.
It's a vampire novel, but I sort of incorporated sort of an MCU Marvel universe, kind of like a modern Marvel universe type dimension to it. So it's not so much like Dracula. It's got more of like an Avengers kind of, like the vampires have different abilities. They have different capacities. They have different stories. It's not so much like the guy in the cape that comes up and goes, "I want to drink your blood."
Is this along the lines of Blade?
No. Well, again, I mean, I'll be honest. I basically incorporated themes from almost every vampire story that I saw. So there's an element of Blade with the Vampire Nation. I don't know if people are familiar with that story, but Blade was a black vampire who, what happened to
half a black vampire? Wasn't he half a vampire or something? Because he wasn't full.
He was, yeah. What they call him a daywalker,
right?
So, I guess technically he was a hybrid.
Okay,
and his thing was he could walk in the day, because his mother was bitten while he was being conceived.
Okay.
And then he was born, and he retained part of the vampire gene. He's actually, because of that, he was actually stronger than the other vampires for the most part. He could walk in the day, but he got older. Mm. It was an interesting thing. Like,
so he aged. He wasn't. He didn't have the snapshot in time where he lived forever. Was he immortal?
They never really discussed that because Twizzler described it. He said he has their speed and strength. He's actually faster and stronger, but he can walk in the day. But he says, he ages, and that's all they said. Okay. I don't think they knew because Blade they'd never been a vampire like Blade before, so they had no idea if at a certain point he would stop getting older. But he was, from what I understand, he was just getting older like a human, but he was immortal. Like, he healed, and and in the book, he was at war. He just wanted to kill all the vampires because in general, all the vampires were basically, from his perspective, evil. But so he didn't drink human blood. He had a serum. Like, he didn't feed on humans in the way the vampires do.
Correct.
So he had a serum. So, yeah, I mean, there's, as far as that element of it, of there being a vampire society, like any of the books that had them, and most of the vampire books do have some form of society. Like the Vampire Lestat, there's a society, but they're more estranged from each other, and they have rules. But whereas in the vampire, in the Blade series, you eventually see the full vampire nation later on, in in the second, I believe it's the second book. Okay. In the first one, they're around. Like, you see, in the first movie, you see them, representatives of them, but you don't see the full. They're just a couple people who are, hey, we're the council. Boom, 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 boom. Of course, they get bumped off.
But what makes and I'll call it a novel right now. But what makes your book unique is Blade is total fantasy. Yours is fantasy, but it's based in fact.
Yes. So it's set in 1991. And what I do is I take the concept of vampires and simply incorporate it into the current events of 1991. There's, again, various legend lore that do that. There's a book called The President's Vampire that does that. There's some elements of that where there's the president has all the presidents have a hotline to a vampire, just in case there's a problem that's too hard. And he's called Kade. So there's a few different books that have done that, but for the most part, the vampires are set off. In this one, I deal with the current events of 1991, and then it goes on for a couple years. And at that time, there's a lot of focus on crime, which is really kind of weird because a lot of the stuff I put in there is happening now, and it wasn't happening when I wrote it because crime wasn't an issue when I started writing it in late 2016, early 2017. Crime was not. People weren't talking about crime a lot.
Sure.
I mean, Trump talked about it a little bit, but it was mostly about, international trade. It was about Trump being
because crime was not a big deal.
No.
Crime was actually dropping.
It was dropping.
Some like to think it was because maybe we were progressing as a society. Mm-hmm. Others said we have less testosterone-filled young men. Maybe that was some of it. Maybe it's a little bit of both.
And some of the economy had been improved steadily over several decades.
Exactly, and if you're working 40 hours a week, you don't have time to raise hell,
and you're less inclined to want to do so because economic despair breeds that type of anxiety and anger, and so basically the book is about one vampire. So it really was about the issues of that time. And the focus of the book was and I'm of course black, but the main character is white, and so we so often see people study black people. This is me doing a perspective on a white. This guy is a Republican in 1991. And a lot of people, because the Republican Party got dominated and defined by Trump, this was a 1990, 1991 unkempt Republican, just living his life.
But we're fresh out of the Reagan era.
Yeah. So it's he's basically what
You're talking about Jack Kemp, who was
Jack
a
Kemp.
vice president
Yes. So
candidate.
so this character is about 32, 33, about 1990. He's a white male, basically lawyer, star athlete in high school, more or less a cool kid, but also somebody who grew up. He grew up in regular Americana, but there was always something. As a mortal, there was something that he was always drawn to the darkness. He didn't know what that meant, so he lived that traditional life that he needed to be a Republican. At the same time, that was all a facade. Like, he had a wife, he had 2 kids because he had to have that, and he was a good father. He took care of his kids. At the same time, he was always going off. Let's say he didn't have a traditional marriage. Let's put it that way.
How so?
He and his wife had an unspoken understanding that they could have other partners.
Okay.
Which is something that was never discussed in the 80s, but I knew about it.
It happened, but we didn't talk about it.
You didn't, especially if you were a person. This person was a lobbyist at this point. The lawyer, and his name is Robert Faulkner. And he's a lawyer, a successful lawyer, and it goes into, he's basically the image of what at the time would be considered that conservative, capitalist, Republican, but he's not like a Trump Republican today. He was more of like son of a kind of guy that would sort of slide towards Ron Paul. Not really a hardcore. He wasn't a hardcore social conservative. He was about it was about capitalism. Yeah. He was about very much pro gun. He was, but at the same time, he's the kind of guy that a lot of people who like Trump would call establishment Republican, because he was a lobbyist. He did work his way to becoming a big name in the game, not necessarily famous, but he was the kind of guy that you go to, hey, you want to get this bill passed, whatever.
So how does this run-of-the-mill Republican, who is just an average guy, run-of-the-mill guy, except for him and his wife like to trip the light fantastic every once in a while, how does he become a vampire?
So, in order to keep up appearances, he doesn't do his other things. And it's not just about sex. He goes to like Cure concerts. Like, he has this double life.
Goes to what?
The Cure. The band The Cure.
Okay, got it.
Like, he goes to these goth concerts, but he doesn't, and it's weird, and it's not that he's afraid of getting in trouble. It's just that's what you didn't do that then. He never made a decision to say, hey, this is what I'm about.
Now, is this something along the lines of Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut, kind of?
Yeah, except it's kind of like that, except that it's not. It is like Eyes Wide Shut, but as far as the adventures he looks for, it's not an established organization. He just goes out and looks for freaks in this other life, and his wife knows he's doing it. They never discuss it. And his wife has a younger boyfriend, and he's okay with it. He actually, so basically what happens is he's got to go out of Chicago. It gets to the point where he's concerned, and so he goes off to Gary, Indiana, and he wakes up the next day, and he doesn't know what's going on, and he gets a phone call from someone, and he knows something's different about him, and he gets a phone call, and it says, you need to show up here, here, and here, because the reason why you feel the way you feel is because your life has changed forever. And that's where it kind of picks. And I put that a little bit deeper in the book, because I start off with him doing his vampire stuff, and then I kind of go back to, why he ended up there. But he ended up there because he was trying to conceal that part of his self from his Republican scene. Because
it wouldn't be accepted.
It wouldn't be accepted. And so that kind of shapes, and then he gets brought into